Thank you, and especially for pronouncing my real name so beautifully. Chkhartishvili. That's a feat. So, every writer likes to speak about his own books. So, today I feel strange and frustrated. I've spoken so many times about my own books, and I believe this is the first time I'm presenting another author and another book. So if by habit I switch into speaking about my own books, please stop me. So I've known Catherine for 11 years. I met her first in 2014. At that time, she was a book. I was a member of the jury for Pushkin Prize. The short list was incredibly good. The competition was harsh, but The Red Fortress, The History of the Kremlin, was unquestionable winner. It was an excellent book, a great book. So now we meet physically in person. This is a good thing, and another excellent thing is that now I see Catherine in a new capacity, and my first question will be about this, because I'm interested, really personally interested in this change, because this is something we have in common. In the first half of my life, I was a philologist, a serious philologist, before I became an author of mass literature, of detective novels. I was a specialist on Japanese literature, Japanese philology, and in Japan, in Japanese tradition, there is a very distinct difference between two kinds of literature. One is called Jun Bungaku, which means clean literature, highbrow literature, respected, and another is Taishu Bungaku, mass literature, disrespected. So after I started writing adventure novels, I was drinking with an old acquaintance of mine, a Japanese professor, specialist on Dostoevsky. And when we drank a lot of vodka, he became un-Japanized, meaning less polite than usual. And he told me brutally, "How could you betray Jun Bungaku?" So this is my question. How could you, Catherine, a respected researcher, a historian, an academic, fall so low? How could you write a detective novel? Please tell me why it happened and how.
Well, Grigory, one answer to that is, how else would we ever have got to meet like this, at the bottom of the pile, together, in the dirt? Another answer is Tom Lehrer's famous answer. Tom Lehrer, of course, as you all know, the late Tom Lehrer, was a fantastic mathematician. That wasn't what he was famous for, though. And he once said, while sitting at the piano, "You know, I don't have to do this for a living." So that's a bit how I feel about writing this. You know, I also am an academic. I promise you, I can still read books with footnotes. But all my life, I have nurtured a secret desire to write fiction. And what happened was that I couldn't go to Russia anymore because of a certain Vladimir Putin, who's made it impossible. And this was my golden opportunity to sit back. I could do one of two things. I could write bad academic books, or I could write bad, naughty, down at the bottom of the pile, not highbrow books. And so I went for the latter.
Interesting. In Russia, everyone blames everything on Vladimir Putin, and here you are grateful to Vladimir Putin. Well, and did you ever try to write fiction earlier in life at some point?
No, but when I used to write academic books, I always felt the most important thing was the reader, and that meant that I had to think about the academic material in a different way from the way a lot of academics do, for which as well as winning prizes, I was criticized by my former colleagues for not attending enough meetings and not sitting long enough in the classroom. So, yes, I have not written fiction before, but I've always nurtured that desire to do so. And let's get a bit more positive, because you started me off at the bottom of the pile being evil, but actually I spent 20 years listening to Russians talking about their lives, listening to their voices and their stories, and sitting in their houses looking at their lives all around me. And I wanted to go on hearing those voices, but I couldn't go back to Russia. So to hear those voices, I had to write them in a different way. And it's been a huge pleasure.
So you've always liked drama, tragedy, Russian stuff. Yeah, because I grew up in Russia and I hate all that. All my life, I've been longing for normal life. So, we have a problem here today because we are going to speak about a detective novel, which is a very dangerous thing because we cannot discuss the plot. We cannot tell you who the bad guy is.
It's really great.
Yeah, so no spoilers.
But it is really great.
Please raise a hand who has read the novel already. So, in the second half of our meeting, when we shall be taking questions from the audience, please, no spoilers in your questions. Promise? Good. I think we can talk about our trade, writing fiction. We can talk about the historical background of the novel. We can talk about Moscow and about Russia, a country which has become so fashionable again. And we shall see where it takes us. So, please tell me, how does it feel to be a young writer? Because you are not a young writer, you are a toddler writer, just 1 year old. And you will, if you continue to write, you will pass through all the traditional ages of a writer. Next stage, you will be an enthusiastic teenager. Then, after 7 years, there will be a midlife crisis. You will be blocked. And this is going to be the real test, because many writers stop there or continue to write trash. You have to overcome this to take a second breath. So, this is going to happen. But I remember very well the euphoria of writing the first novel. When I had to go to the office, I would shut down the door every time I had 15 minutes and would write something, and it would feel so great, so not boring. So, how did it feel?
Great and not boring. The difficult thing is to move away from the academic voice, to give up on giving a lecture, which I could very easily do now, but I'm not going to, I promise, and to try to think, how do I recreate this world that I want you to see and I want you to inhabit with me in a way that takes you in and makes it fascinating and makes you want to stay there. And heck, it's Moscow in 1934, which is about as horrible a world as I can take you to, because we have Stalin, we have famine, we have people on the streets who have no home, we have peasants who've just been collectivized. How do I make that into the material for a novel? So it wasn't exactly euphoric, because it was both difficult technically, and there were a number of moral issues that arose about Russia in 1934 being the subject of a detective story. But it's fascinating, and I'm still fascinated, and if that is a sign that I'm a 1-year-old, then bring it on, really. But it will continue, I know, to be difficult, because this isn't writing about I don't know, bodice rippers in the 19th century or wonderful Tudors riding around on horses. This is a real place. I know it very well. Some of you know a lot about it. It's not nice. And to make that into the stuff of fiction is quite a challenge.
And how did your first character appear, and how did you make him, I guess it was him, alive?
My first character had a sex change. My first character, I initially planned, I must be careful of spoilers, I initially planned to make my detective a woman because I thought that would be interesting and because I thought I understood women better than men, mostly, and I thought that would actually be intriguing in the Russian context. And then I had this woman relate to a member of the secret police who was more powerful than she was, who was a man. And gradually I realized that this poor woman was falling into the arms of this secret policeman, being rescued from difficult situations in his car, you know, that he was the one with all the authority and she was the one who needed him. And I thought, no, I'm going to make the secret policeman a woman and she's going to have the power and I'm going to make the man the detective. And therefore I turn it round and suddenly everything became terribly exciting and interesting. Because, first of all, there aren't that many really nasty women in Russian history, but there are a few. One thinks of a particularly unpleasant woman called Zemlyachka, who murdered tens of thousands of people in the Crimea in 1920. I don't have anybody that nasty in my book, but I do have powerful women, and I do have some weak men. And that was fun.
Oh, you said something interesting. You said that...
So, just one.
No, just one thing which struck me as... You said that you know and understand women better than men. That's what you said? How strange, because for me it's quite the opposite. Like for 42 years I've been living with my wife, so I've been basically studying and researching women, and I think I know them much more than I know men. That's how I feel. And interesting. So, did you know how everything was going to end from the very beginning?
No. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I talked to a writer of crime novels very early on. A woman took me out to lunch. I won't name her in case I say something she doesn't like. And she was very helpful. And she said, think of a crime novel as being like an aeroplane. You can take off from the ground and you can fly, but you've actually got to land the darn thing. And I can take off, I can fly, and then I got to the end. I knew what I wanted to have happen, but that's not what happened in the end, because the characters were so much more autonomous than I expected. So I had to write an ending that fitted them, so it's the characters who decided. I mean, the ending isn't wildly different from what I thought, but it's not quite what I thought.
That's very unusual for a detective novel, which is basically a very architectural thing. Yeah, because in order to build this building, you have to have the plan and know how many floors there will be, and the spire on the top and everything.
Yours is a building, mine's a plane.
No, this is called, we in Japan call it zuihitsu, following the brush. So, like a river. I tried writing a couple of novels like, I'm not going to speak about my books, I forgot. So, let us talk about, I just started to think about it and I wasn't able to find a solution. How will you translate the title of your novel into Russian when it is published there? Because in English it sounds interesting. Moscow underground, there are all sorts of second meanings and connotations. In Moscow it sounds like Moskovskое metro. You cannot name a novel like that. Did you think about it?
I have not yet considered what will happen. I think it highly unlikely that this book will be translated into Russian. Much more interesting what we do about translating it into other languages, including American, for instance. But The title was not my original title. The title was discussed with my publisher. And I very much hope that whoever wants to take it on in any other country in Europe and any other continent, Japan, for instance, will be as creative as my publisher was in thinking of a title that will work. Because I agree with you, Moskovsky Metro won't sell.
No, it won't do. How would you translate into Russian? Who speaks Russian here?
Московское подполье.
Moskovskoye podzemye? Because we need something mysterious and sinister here. Metro is just...
But the metro is fascinating. Maybe not for Russians, but for me, having gone to Russia for the first time in the 80s and traveled all around Moscow on the metro as a young, sort of wide-eyed undergraduate student, I found the metro amazing. And it's a sign of dictatorship. I mean, only authoritarian dictatorships build undergrounds like that. Only authoritarian dictatorships have the nerve to say this is a palace for the people, when it's actually a hellhole, and put paintings all over it of happy peasants when actually the peasants are dying and all the rest of it. The metro is fascinating. So if a Russian reader has any perception of their own country, just as I have of women, maybe they will see what's interesting about that.
Yeah, that was my next question about the Moscow subway, because it was probably the most strong experience of my childhood. I grew up in Moscow, which was basically a very depressing town with lacking color. Dominating colors were gray and brown, grayish, brownish, that sort of thing. But when you went underground, you got into a magic land. Beautiful palaces, marble, yeah, mosaics, everything. And I had this notion when I was a kid that there were two kinds of Moscow, one boring and dull, and there was another kind of Moscow, mysterious, hidden somewhere, and then you need to look for it and to dig for it. And it gave the town, I don't know, it made the town interesting, this another Moscow hidden underground.
You have just summed up why I wrote the book, that there is a hidden city underneath the city, and secrets hidden underneath the city. And the metro is only part of that story, because of course there are parallel tunnels, there are chambers, there are lost palaces. There really are lost palaces under Moscow. And there were people who, sorry?
Treasures, buried there, just a little hint.
Buried rivers. Anything you want, it's under there. And in fact, in the early part of this millennium, when I was still going to Moscow, I went under Moscow with the diggers to have a look at some of these places. Of course, there are people who have in their minds maps of this whole underworld, these catacombs, these underworld palaces, and connections which you can follow, which will take you to the monasteries, for instance, on the outsides of the city, or they say they will. We actually chickened out when we found a dead rat, but we'd also run out of vodka and the batteries on the torch were going. So there were a number of reasons why my research trip ended, but one of them was that it was a bit wet and cold down there, but it was very interesting. When I was researching the Kremlin, I was talking to the chief archaeologist of the Kremlin, who agreed to show me her PhD thesis, which was about the archaeology of the Kremlin and these tunnels. And she took me to her office, and she opened her PhD thesis, and then she put her hand, a large, meaty hand, straight onto the PhD thesis and said, "No, you may not look. Geology of Kremlin is state secret." So, what is underneath is not something we're supposed to know. The other sad thing is that the Soviet state promised the working class palaces. palaces for the future and for the mankind, for all mankind, you know, not just for Soviet mankind, but for all of us. We were going to follow the Soviets into the glorious future. And the only palaces they built are buried.
This is something I really do not understand, because beginning of 1930s, Russia is an impoverished country, totally. Famine, housing crisis, lack of everything, cards for provision, and still they decide to spend an enormous amount of money when they needed every ruble and every dollar to buy equipment from abroad for industrialization. Still, they spent incredible amount of money on this, I don't know, on this show, which was not even on the ground, because it would have been logical to build some palaces like Stalin did afterwards with his skyscrapers. No, they hid it in the ground. Do you know why?
Well, they didn't intend that to be the end of the story. First of all, they did intend to build the Palace of Soviets, which was going to be the tallest building in the world, and it was going to be the most magnificent.
It was later. It was 1935, the general plan of reconstruction.
But the plans for it were approved in 1934 at the same time as I'm writing this story. So they were going to build a palace above ground. The palaces underground were built for another reason. First of all, they were built with looted raw materials from buildings that had been torn down. So a lot of the marble, a lot of the bronze, a lot of the decoration came from churches that had been destroyed or from palaces that had been looted by them, which didn't cost them a huge amount. But the other reason for doing it was they had this long discussion in the planning committees of the Moscow Communist Party. We cannot put the workers underground. Look at London. Look at the tube. It's horrible. These poor people, they cram in there. New York, it's disgusting. We can't do this, but we need an underground system. So we've got to make it nice, or it really won't be Soviet. It won't be communist. It won't be suitable. So they had long discussions about what to do. They were terrified that people wouldn't use it because it was underground. So they wanted it lit, they wanted it beautiful, and then of course Stalin wanted it more than that. He wanted money pouring into it because it became a showcase. Because then they're competing with New York, London, Paris, Berlin, to show that the Soviet Union is the leader of the world.
Well, I think they probably understood that they couldn't beat New York above the ground, so they decided to beat it underground.
The competition wasn't that very hot, was it, with the New York subway?
Exactly.
Easy one to win.
Yes, that was probably it. Okay, so when did you first come to the Soviet Union?
1982.
Oh, horrible time.
I almost never went back. I mean, it was absolutely so horrible, but I did go back.
Horrible time. 1982, it was the year that Brezhnev died, and still Andropov and Chernenko were still to come. It was just the peak or the bottom of the Cold War. War in Afghanistan, Poland, boycott of Olympics. I remember myself, I was 26, knowing perfectly well that nothing awaits me here in this life, and that no plans for future, only drinking with my friends, nothing else. It was, so you came in that town, you saw that listless, boring place, and you had been studying the language for some years.
I was a historian. I was an undergraduate historian at this point. I learnt Russian as a schoolgirl because I had learnt French and I was disruptive in the French class. And the teacher said, you must learn another language. We cannot keep you in this class with these other poor students, so you can learn German. And I said, I don't want to learn German. I want to learn Italian. They said, we don't teach Italian in this school, but one of the teachers has just been on a Russian course, why don't you learn Russian? And this teacher took me after school into her own house and taught me Russian from a textbook. I've seen her in her very old age. I went to visit her to thank her, and she still got her notes from her Russian course back in the 1970s. She taught me Russian, and she made it so interesting. I wanted to know more. And I'm afraid it's your wretched language. That's what's done for me. I am absolutely hooked from that point on, because Russian is so, the language,
By the language.
The language and what the language conveys and the culture that's behind it. And then I started meeting people, and the people were so interesting and their lives were so complicated. I couldn't stop. It's like a drug. No, I know you're not convinced, but it was.
Well, at that time, I thought that I was extremely unlucky to be born in the USSR.
But I had a British passport.
You did? Yeah, but still, no, I don't think so. I think that I was very lucky to be born there. But when I realized it, I was already much older. Because when you are born in Russia in 1956, like myself, and you are still alive in 2025, it means that you have lived several times, several lives, because this is a country which has changed and changed and changed 5 or 6 times. And this is interesting. This is interesting to watch, and it tests you all the time.
But for me, that's exactly the point. I feel like the most privileged person imaginable, because when I first went in 1982, it was ghastly, but very interesting as somebody with a British passport and the ability to go home. And from then on, every year, like watching a magic lantern show, you know, you sort of go each year and you see another set of frames and you put them together, flick, flick, flick. It has changed more than anywhere I've ever known. It's always fascinating. The friendships I have made there have been very deep, and therefore people have told me their life stories, people of my generation. I've watched them go through the things you're describing, from the time when I had a Geiger counter and chickens on the balcony to provide the food, and the Geiger counter was to go to the market with after Chernobyl, and people said, you know, you really shouldn't be here, that sort of thing. That kind of really low point. And in the 1990s, when we went shopping and the only thing in the food shops was smetana, there was nothing else at all to be bought in the Sokolniki region of Moscow at that particular point, other than the eggs I had from the chickens, who were neurotic and needed to be fed on eggs, unfortunately. So, I mean, the amazing number of surreal stories, and those surreal stories have changed. So at one point, it's looking after my friends who have got nothing to eat by going to the foreign currency shops. Then 10 years later, I'm in a supermarket in Moscow, and I overheard a man and a woman discussing me, in Russian obviously, and one said to the other, she's obviously English, she can't afford to shop here. So, you know, this sort of scale of change has been completely mesmerizing. I don't like what's happened in the last 10 years, so it's been very difficult, but I can't say it's not interesting.
Yes, but had I come to Moscow in 1982, I would have never returned to that place. Of course, like 5 or 6 years later, it was probably the most interesting place on the earth. And then in 1990s, it was quite scary. And then it was bubbling and becoming wealthy, which is always fun to watch. All the nouveau riche and and then it started to slowly to freeze again, and now it turned into a sort of Third Reich. Yeah, an interesting country. In the Chinese sense of this world.
Yes, I was in one of the archives talking to the man who's in charge of the archive, the director. And he said, I do get fed up with you foreigners coming here and saying it's not boring. I long for boring. And he said, I totally understand. He said, what I would like is a boring life with dental insurance. so, but that's one of the things I love about going to Russia, or used to before it became both immoral and impossible to go, which is that there's this directness, which comes, I think, partly from the hard way people have lived and the way they've had
Directness?
to be... Yes.
It comes out of national impoliteness.
Which which is good fun. I'm British, I'm English. You know, we're English. We don't say anything to each other ever. Suddenly you've got somebody who's prepared to be direct. It's great. Therapeutic even.
Yes, yes. Well, when I think of something that I treasure most in this world, in this society, it would be politeness. Because I grew up in the Soviet Union, there are very few people around us whom we need to love us. From the rest of the mankind, politeness would be totally enough. That's that's what you think, at least when you live in Russia. Okay, now let us talk about history. You said in an interview something which I disagree with. So here we come to the point where we need a conflict and argument, okay?
And you're going to be polite.
Yeah, this is the plot, this is how it goes. You said that there is no such thing as a Russian path of history, that everything depends on the ruler in a certain epoch where he or she takes the country, something like that?
I don't think it depends on the ruler entirely, because the ruler is created to some extent by the... You're looking at my notes. Yeah, you're going back 10 years. This is cruel. This is not polite. But however, he wants a conflict. Let's have some blood. The book you so admire, Red Fortress, I wrote that history of the Kremlin with a specific aim in mind, which was to try and puncture the idea I'd been taught and that everybody assumes, and you hear it all the time, you heard it in all the literature that was written around the time of Perestroika, the early 21st century. Russia is always like that. I remember Walter Laqueur, an American historian, saying, too much freedom makes Russians uncomfortable. I thought, like hell, you know, these are people who are anarchic. This is not true. Russia does not have, any more than Germany had, a Sonderweg. Russia does not have a Sonderweg. Russia has complicated, chaotic possibilities. And when I went into the Kremlin, right at the beginning of doing the research for Red Fortress, I remember so vividly being taken into the basement of a church by one of the Kremlin keepers, a woman who looked after Kremlin buildings. And she took me down a long corridor, down the stairs into a 14th century church, and then down into the crypt of that 14th century church. And while we were there, she said, don't tell the fire department. And the reason she didn't want anybody to talk about what was there were communist flags. There were flags from the Tsarist era. There was junk from the last 150 years. And the church itself, of course, was nearly 1,000 years old. So there we were, surrounded by the Russias that had been and were no more. And the idea that the Russia I was in then, which was the Russia of, let's say, 2011, was determined by the Russia of 1147 is absurd. It wasn't. Of course, it's a great big landmass, got no natural boundaries, covered in people on horseback shooting arrows at each other in the sort of Middle Ages. There's all sorts of things that happened which are different from here, but it doesn't have to be Putin.
No, it was not determined by 1947, but it was determined by 15th century, I think, when the Russian state was founded and built, and in spite of all the changes, its foundation hasn't changed, and I believe it dictates the Russian history until now. It hasn't changed, and I think that although Vladimir Putin is not a sympathetic person, I think if it wouldn't be him, it would be some other Putin. It would have ended in totally the same fashion. So not so much depends on a ruler in Russia. In fact, if a ruler historically tried to break away from this algorithm, from this pattern, he would be either killed or overthrown. Because there is a logic in the state, a certain logic, which is dictated, as far as I understand it now, having written 10 volumes of Russian history, I understand it now very well, because what happened did not happen because of some coincidences or chance factors. It was totally logical, because this country, I mean Russia, was built in 15th century as a hyper-centralized state. It was already very big in 15th century and very diverse. In order to keep it together, it had to be ruled from one spot by one man, and the bigger country became, the more, I don't know, this law, it became more and more dominant.
Can I interrupt you and tell you, about 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Sweden at the time of the anniversary of the Battle of Poltava. And the Swedes were discussing the outcome of that battle, which was, of course, that Peter the Great was able to consolidate part of the Russian Empire. And they looked at each other, these charming Swedish politicians I was having dinner with, and they said, you know, if we'd won, Sweden would be a great empire, and Russia would be a lovely little country where they made Nokia phones and, you know, they had technological progress. Why not?
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. And if it was the fight between two empires, Swedish and Russian, and Swedes, when they lost, historically, they were the winners, because instead of becoming an empire, they became a national state. A national state lives for itself, basically. And Russia became an empire, and it was a very strange empire, because usually empires suck blood from colonies. Russia was an empire where its own people still remained very poor, very humiliated, powerless. It was that sort of empire.
But they're no longer poor, first, and secondly, they have access to an international media world that they did not have before. And one of the things that is so surprising and not inevitable about Putin is that in the early part of the 21st century, you met Russians on the beach in Turkey. You met Russians in London. There are thousands of them in London, millions actually. So this is a country where people are no longer isolated, poor, sitting at home waiting for the next pile of manure to land on their heads. These are people who actually have agency. So something changed, and it wasn't inevitable. But we can go on all night, and there will be blood on the floor, but we do disagree, I think, on this one.
Yes, because I could say the same thing about Chinese, who can also travel and who are not starving. This is not something which determines the nature of a state or of a society. Because Russia was a democratic country in the 1990s. It started going back when the Chechen War started, when Yeltsin had to make a choice whether he'd let part of the countries go or whether he wants to keep it hyper-centralized. And when he made the choice to start a war, the rest followed.
Yeah, but it was a choice. It was a choice, Grigory. It didn't have to be like that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what I mean. In order for Russia to stop being an empire, to get a possibility of becoming a free country, it has to become a confederation. Until it becomes a confederation, until it continues to be ruled from one place, no democracy is possible, no parliament, no elections are possible, no independent courts are possible. Supposing tomorrow Putin dies, there is, I don't know, a revolution. Russia becomes a democratic country again. If it stays the way it is, a few years from now, the new democratic president will have to choose either he will remain a president or he will remain a Democrat. Both things would be incompatible. This is what I mean, and this is something which I understand very well. Jefferson said about United States of America in the 18th century, this is too big a country to be ruled by one government. So Russia has to become United States of Eurasia. Otherwise, it would never be free. That's what I think.
Well, we really need Mr. Navalny to be here, and unfortunately, he cannot be.
We talked about him and argued about him many times, and he did include in his program of the beautiful Russia of the future, this is, I think it was number 1, confederation. So he came to that idea too. So 45 minutes have gone. Shall we start taking questions?
We could do that. Yeah. Yeah.
So please, if you have questions, we have another microphone, don't we?
No.
No. Take mine.
Now I can say what I like. He's lost it.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. Could go on all night. I find it hard to envisage what an underground Soviet palace would look like, or quite why it would be there. Could you elaborate on? I mean, I know the Moscow Underground well enough, but what was the point of it, and why did it not quite work, and what were they meant to look like and be for?
I think we've managed to confuse you, or I have. When we're talking about underground palaces that are still there, we're talking about palaces that were built maybe in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, which, since the city has, like everywhere, risen up, are now partially buried. The most magnificent was Galitzyn's palace, which was very close to the Kremlin. Prince Galitzyn, who was Catherine the Great's lover and a great alchemist, and he had a laboratory where he did fantastic alchemical experiments, and he had a secret passage that connected him to the inside of the Kremlin, lots and lots of wonderful things going on. His palace was excavated in the 1920s by a group of professional archaeologists and architects and brought to the surface. And it was then, under Stalin, demolished to make room for the Gosplan building. So there was a palace, it was unearthed, and there are many, many more that are still there. Maybe not entirely, but there are whole rooms. Another thing that I was fascinated by was something called the sluch, which, again, I discovered through reading about the history of Moscow before I wrote this book, which was that in the 14th century and before, during the time of the Mongol invasions, how do you protect the city against the horsemen that are coming across the steppe before you can even see them? They ride so fast. So what you did was you dug underground and you made a chamber which you lined with copper. And then when the horses were galloping, the copper vibrated and the sentries could hear it and warn the people above ground that they were coming. Well, the sluchy still exist underground. And when they were building the Moscow metro, they kept coming across solid walls that they didn't understand. What's this doing here? It's not part of any fortification. It's not part of the old city wall. And it was a sluch. Another thing they discovered were wine cellars, which had very nice solid walls, thank you very much. And they were also in the way of the metro building. So there's lots underground that is not, in the strict speaking, it's not a palace you can see. It's the remains of a palace, or it's the foundations of a palace, or it's fortifications. Then, of course, as Grigory Boris just said, the metro itself, as you probably know, is a string of magnificent palaces built for the workers to travel.
From what you say, you're not likely to go into Russia anytime soon. but are your books getting to Russia? And if so, are people reacting to them in a positive way? And what is the view of the Russian government, if they have one?
I had a death threat based on Ivan's War. I don't think they like it very much. But that's interesting because the books that I wrote in the time when I did go to Russia were largely based on the voices of Russians speaking to me. So what was said to me in the 90s and the early part of this century is now repudiated by the very people who said it, or by their children, or the generation of their children. So in the 90s, I talked to people who were in the Cheka during the Civil War. I talked to people who shot people during the Second World War, and people who were in the secret services responsible for shooting their own people in Moscow, that sort of thing, plus ordinary soldiers, people who survived the Gulag. I talked to priests, the whole range of different kinds of Russian. And I have their stories in my heart and in my ears still. But if you went to Russia now, those stories are mute because they come from another world that has now been pushed away in favor of a myth of Russian history, which is being taught from primary school upward, indeed pre-primary school upward, which includes none of those voices. So some of my books have been translated, not Ivan's War, which is the most controversial because it involves comments about the Great Patriotic War and about the Red Army and its behavior, including the word cowardice, which people have rather taken against, based on archives. I didn't make it up, but it's not allowed. Night of Stone was translated, Death and Memory. Most people say that they've read it, but they don't really get it. You know, I remember talking to people about post-traumatic stress, and at the end of the conversation, the woman said, "It's terribly interesting, but what is post-dramatic stress?" And I had to explain, not drama. So it's tricky.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's really inspirational. But I wanted to ask you, you're obviously a historian and know a lot about Russian history. What's your relationship with Russian literature? Where are you standing on that? And the second question, apart from Moscow and Russia, have you been elsewhere, in Ukraine in particular?
I don't stand on Russian literature. I tend to lie on the sofa with it. I love Russian literature, of course I do. And I don't think, looking at particularly the great writers of the 19th century, that we should push them aside because of what has happened in Ukraine. Appalling, indefensible, immoral, disgusting, and completely, I'm afraid, beyond the realms of what is humane, though the invasion of Ukraine is. It's not Dostoevsky's fault. You know, you can't blame Chekhov. You can read those things, you can try and draw lines into the present if you like, but those people had other demons to fight, and they fought them very bravely for the most part, in their own time and in their own place. I have indeed been to Ukraine. I have indeed. And I've been to Kiev, and I've been to Lviv, and I've been to parts of Ukraine beyond those cities, and thoroughly loved it. What has struck me going to Ukraine is I feel like some of the Ukrainian writers who have said, I've been Russianized, my brain has been colonized. It takes quite a lot of effort to decolonize my own brain, because I started out learning Russian, and I go to Ukraine and I hear Ukrainian, and at first I have to think, you know, that they're lisping, or, you know, they're hochlotats, and then you have to, that's their language. These people, this is their country, and they have a different culture and a different history. And another thing that came out of writing Red Fortress was that Russia owes a huge amount of its culture to Ukraine, which was the bridge between Russia and Europe, and where an enormous amount of what became later Russian culture was actually learnt from the Ukrainians, from Kiev and from Lviv, from the Austrian Empire, from Galicia and so on. And being in Ukraine taught me that. And it's the most wonderful place, and I wish it so well.
Thank you so much. Dictatorships usually like to show off their wealth. So what was the reasoning behind trying to hide the wealth in the underground and in the palaces? Thank you.
Well, it's not hidden if it's in the underground, is it? Because if you're a tourist and you go to Moscow, one of the first things you do is you go on a metro tour. It's very accessible if you're a tourist because the metro is quite cheap, even now. And, well, I don't know how cheap it is now because I haven't been for years, but last time I went it was quite reasonably cheap. And people go round and round and they look at, you know, and they're amazed. Look, you know, we have the tube, which I've just been on. They have trains that run reliably every 2 minutes and they're absolutely beautiful and the people look happy and it's cheap and look at these stations. So in a way, that's exactly what tyrannies do. I've just been watching Michael Palin's program about Venezuela and I was very struck by Caracas has the most fantastic underground system. You know, this is what dictatorships do. They also build palaces above ground and Stalin was pretty good at that after the war. But before the war, the palace they wanted to build, they couldn't. So they knocked down the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, which was itself a monument to tyranny in a different way. And they were going to build the Palace of Soviets. But the ground was unstable, they couldn't get it to work, they didn't have the money, they couldn't drain the marsh. And as we all know, what they did instead with that huge site was turn it into a swimming pool, because that was the only thing they could do with it for years and years and years. I never got to swim in it because I couldn't face the health tests they insisted on. You couldn't swim in that swimming pool unless you went through some fairly rigorous and invasive health tests, including a blood test. And one look at a Russian doctor made me think I didn't want them coming anywhere near me. Soviet doctor, I should say. And now, of course, what they've done with that site is rebuild the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, which is a monument to tyranny. So they do it above ground too.
I'm just wondering, how does your historical background translate into fiction writing? And do you think it's helpful or it kind of enriches your fiction essentially?
Well, it's difficult because I lived in the 1930s when I was doing my research. And when I came to write this book, I wanted you to live in the 1930s with me, which means you have to know where you are. And the biggest problem, and Grigory and I were talking about it just now, for a historical fiction writer is how much do you tell your reader? Because if you tell them too much, you exhaust their curiosity. You actually kill their curiosity by just saying, you know, it was like this, 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 and this. And if you look on, you know, page 63, it was like this too. So you, somehow or other, I had to take you into Moscow in 1934, show you how surreal it was. Not a bit like Moscow now, not a bit like London, not like Europe. This weird place I had to explain. And I had to share my enthusiasm without making you want to throw the book at the wall because it was too didactic. And that was a balance that was very, very difficult to get and also very stimulating for me. How much of what I have loved and known as a historian is necessary for somebody now to understand that time and live in it with me? And if you read the book, perhaps you'll let me know.
Hello. I look forward to reading Moscow Underground. The question is not asking for any spoilers about your book. You did mention all the tunnels under Moscow and the plans they have. So I wanted to ask, if a Soviet leader happened to fall on bad times and needed to make a quick exit and went into the escape tunnels, how far would they get in these tunnels and where would they pop up?
That's a very interesting question. It's not, of course, something we're meant to know. I have never asked a Soviet leader because, strangely enough, none of them was willing to talk to me, which isn't surprising. I did ask Putin's interpreter that question. Putin's interpreter's name is Mr. Fakov. And I think that tells you what he said to me when I asked the question. The answer was not forthcoming. However, I have talked to people who are tunnel engineers, and I have talked to historians including Russian historians, people like Khlyevnyuk, who are extremely well connected to the archives, know what they're doing, live there virtually. And the answer is you would certainly get out as far as Stalin's dachas. And then once you got that far, you'd be fine. So during the 1991 coup, a lot of people got out of the Kremlin by means that were not visible. They went down rather than out. So I suspect there is definitely a way out that we don't know about. There's certainly an underground tunnel connecting Staraya Ploshchad with the Kremlin. So, you know, once you know that, and once you know that there's a parallel tunnel connecting the Kremlin to Kuntsevo, then you're pretty well out of Russia already, out of Moscow already, and probably out of Russia too, if you want to be.
Yeah, Stalin had his personal.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
One detail I really enjoyed about the book was that characters are often hungry and they talk about food, and there's a lot of discussion about that. I just wondered why you felt that detail was important. I felt it made it feel quite lived in, but I'm curious about that.
Right. Well, first of all, I have spent a lot of time in Russia and been very hungry. But the main thing is people who went through the famine and also people who went through the Civil War never stopped talking about food. I've been to St. Petersburg as well, where people who went through the blockade never stopped talking about food. Young people who were in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, to this day still say, I wanted to stay near the cooking pots. So it was something that was very important to them. Then for me, I thought, well, actually for the reader, it's nice to be able to think about these people doing something with food. So if I take 1933 as the year where I write my novel for. Impossible. There were no cafes. There was no food. So, you know, how can I write a novel you're going to want to read where everybody's starving to death? You're not really going to like that. But 1934, things were beginning to get better, quite noticeably better. And it was then a subject of conversation amongst everybody. You know, where's the cafe? They're going to take bread off the ration. I mean, bread was rationed, but they were about to stop rationing it. There was meat available for the first time. People started to talk about food, so it was very, very important to them because of what they'd been through. And then, of course, it becomes a device for me to make you feel that you're there. It's not illegal, I think, to do that.
I have a question. May I have a question now. So, speaking about historical novels, and this problem of making people see, understand the realia they have no idea about. Didn't you think of installing photographs in your book? Would you like that?
I would prefer to write a photograph than put one in. I think a photograph kills the imagination of the person reading the book if it's fiction and novel they're reading, because it says this was it, so that's it. So you've seen it, you then move on. I want you to be drawn in and to be curious and to stay with me, not to see the photograph and turn the page. I love the photographs. I used them. I had them on my desk. I had them on my screen when I was writing. But I didn't want to put them in the book because that's the sort of thing you do with non-fiction to illustrate, you know, your non-fiction definitely. But fiction, you've got to be able to conjure that world so that for everybody it's their world. So if you read something that's been written by, I don't say me, but a good novelist will create a world for you. And for each of us, it's different. And when we see, for instance, a dramatization of Jane Austen or whatever, you say, well, that's not my Jane Austen. That's some, you know, I want it to be your Moscow, not the photograph.
But it's not a fictional Moscow. It's if you, instead of describing how Kremlin looks, you can just put a photograph and save the tempo, the time, because I put illustrations and photographs in all of my books, and now I even insert where a melody is mentioned. You can take your smartphone and put it on the page, and you can actually listen to it. Why don't we writers use the new opportunities, like it, especially in a historical book?
need the new opportunity this gives me. I think that's a different book. Of course, I mean, it would be great fun to be able to do that, but that wasn't what I was trying to do. I'm very much looking forward to your book, which has the wiki links, and I shall be very interested to see what you've done. But I was moving away from that to create a world that will be real for everybody in their own way. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, actually the trouble is it did have to be historically accurate. So while I was writing and creating my Moscow and creating my characters, I constantly had the voice of the academic critic sitting on my shoulder saying, you haven't looked that up, have you, Catherine? You don't know. It might have been March, not April. But it actually, in the end, although that does matter because you have to tell the truth and it has to be real, what I want is for it to be real to you as well as to me. And I think if I put in a link to Wikipedia, that's dodging that one. That's creating a different kind of story.
I guess there will be a sequel to this roman, to this novel. You can feel that, right?
I have to grow up, you said.
Yeah, you will. You have no choice now. You stepped in this river, you will, you will swim. There is no way back. No, I'm not asking about what the sequel is going to be about because this is, I guess, pretty evident. We're in 1934. We are approaching very interesting times, right? So, but maybe we'll just think about it. It gives especially a British writer just a chance to visualize what you describe in words. Maybe we'll just think about it.
I'll think about it. I'll think about it. This one, the next one, that is difficult for another reason, and I want to ask you about that, which is you create the characters in volume 1, so you have Irast van Doren in your volume 1, and terrible things happen to him. No spoilers. Akunin's books are wonderful. In volume 2, how much do you assume your reader knows about what happened to Irast in volume 1? Could you tell us that? How do you do that? Because it would be useful to me.
Well, every novel in a series, in my case, is autonomous. It should suffice, because you never know when there are a lot of books in the series from which novel a reader would start. So it has been written in a way that you can just start with this book. But if someone had read a prequel, it would be like a bonus. He would understand more. He would be in a privileged situation. So this is the sort of combination.
I'll learn. I watch and learn. Thank you very much.
To continue on this theme, could you both perhaps reflect, as writers, on the statement that post-truth favours fiction? AKA, what is more broadly, what could the relationship be between historical writing, historical imagination, and a post-truth environment?
I would like to quote Dame Hilary Mantel on that, who had the most beautiful way of putting this in her Reith lectures. She said, "You must not lie." And I think when writing about history as a novelist, you are under an even greater obligation not to lie. Historians disagree among themselves. Historians go in for postmodern discussions about the meaning of things in a very post-truthian sort of way. But if you're writing historical fiction and it's not real, you might as well pack up. Unless you say this is fantasy, which of course is another romantasy. We can all write that. We could do it together, all of us. We could probably write one tonight. That's a different field. But to write historical fiction and not to keep it true, I think makes for something very unsatisfactory. But what do you think?
Well, of course, I've thought a lot about it, and I have my own methods for that. Like, my principle is that in a historical novel, you can describe something that could have happened, that might have happened. If it is known for sure that it did not happen, no. Then you don't change history. But if there is a chance that there was a different explanation to the fact, then it's within your powers. Another trick that I use, if I introduce a historical character, I slightly change his or her name. So it would be recognizable. I change just one letter. But still, reader would know that it is my character, not history's character.
My Stalin is Stalin. I have to do that because you deal with the 19th century, and that's less familiar maybe, and for your Russian readers even less familiar. I remember how enthusiastic everybody was about your books because it was a window into the 19th century. They loved it for that, apart from the stories and the detective. But if I lie, if I make him Stalin, it's not going to work, is it? These characters have got to be real.
Stalin probably not.
Yeah, Kaganovich and Khrushchev and.
Yeah, but I have a novel about Stalin, but I called him always the leader. I never named him Iosif Vissarionovich or Stalin. No, I didn't.
It's a really interesting question, I think.
I have a question, also about characters. Do you have a favorite one in the book, or is there one which was the most interesting for you to write?
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Freud would say that all the characters are manifestations of my nasty subconscious. But stuff Freud. Do I have a favorite character? There are one or two I like more than the others. I'm very fond of Misha because he's a chef. I'm very fond of Anton because he's my detective. I like Anton's father as well. Actually, I like them all, except the baddies. And even the baddies are quite interesting. Because if you don't engage with them, if you actually don't like them, how can you think about how they work? Is that right? Is that how you feel? I mean, you obviously like Fandorin.
There was just one regret about your characters. It's a pity that we know that Anton has lived to the old age. So we don't need to worry whether he'll get killed or not. That's a pity.
Well, we could do a post-truth Anton. The reason Anton is like that is, of course, because he's one of the people talking to me, and that's how I came to write the book. I imagined me sitting in a room with my tape recorder, and Anton in his 80s, and the biscuits on the table, and the tape recorder going, and the cat sitting on possibly Anton and smelling a bit, and me hearing the story. And so that's how I came to hear his voice. He is talking to me, and that's how it works for me.
And have you made a portrait of Anton with AI or something? Because that's what I do always.
I'm not that good with AI. No, what I did do was, for all my characters, I did what Turgenev did. And I wrote biographies of absolutely every single one of them because I want to know when they're born. Because if you're writing about the Soviet Union, it matters critically if someone was born before 1914, before 1917, 1921, they're going to get killed in the war. If they starved in the famine, you need to know all those things. You need to know who their parents were. The state wants to know who their parents were and what their parents did. So I did all that, and I have a great big file. It doesn't include pictures, but I have a very pictorial mind, so I can see them anyway in my head.
Yes, that's great, because I grew up to that idea only by my novel number 4. When I discovered this Stanislavski system for my novel, which means that even if an actor comes in and says, well, dinner is served, still you have to know everything about him. Everything, otherwise he would be just a function. So yes, a file with all the characters and all their histories even if it doesn't go into the book, yes, this is a must.
And a great deal didn't go into the book, which is why I have so much paper in my study, because I did write for every single character that background. The only cat, even the cat. I know where they came from, I know what they look like, I know a lot about them, and I know a lot of incidents in their lives that didn't get into the book, but may at some later stage do so. And by doing that, I could actually hear their voices in my study. It's very oral as well. I don't know if that's true for you, but when I'm writing and somebody's speaking, I can hear them because I know what happened to them last week and what happened to them when they were 15. And so I can actually imagine them speaking.
Yeah, and they learned not to get in their way, because as soon as they become alive and start to interact, just step away and let them do what they need to do.
Which is what they did do. Sometimes very nastily.
Can I just take us back to the 1930s, obviously, which is where the book is based. And I mean, obviously, you understand the whole sweep of Russian history, but seem to have a particular focus. And I think you implied in earlier research, you took yourself to the 30s. I mean, any decade in Russian history or Soviet history is fascinating, sort of by definition. But what particularly drew you to the 30s as a time for particular study? What was it about that decade, which both in your own research and then what led on to the novel, gripped you when any decade could have done, really?
I love the 20s too. I think 20s are very, very interesting. But when I was doing interviews for Night of Stone, which was the very first book that I wrote that was based on interviews, and I suppose I should tell you why I did that so that you have a better idea of the answer to your question. My PhD was on politics in Moscow. When I finished that, like a good researcher, I was going to write a political biography of a character in the Moscow Communist Party. And I was in Moscow in 1993, and there were tanks outside the archive, and people were getting shot. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to be in here. I want to be out there. I want to know what's going on, and I want to hear what people are thinking about it. And the minute I started wanting people to talk to me, then I had to talk to people who were still alive, and that meant the 1930s, because if you go back too far, there aren't any. And I went along to Memorial to talk to them about whether there was anybody who would be willing to talk to a Western researcher about their experience of Stalinism. And they said, difficult, you're a foreigner. Come back next Wednesday, we'll see what we can do. We'll see if we can find you anyone. We'll find you someone. So I went back the following Wednesday, and there was an enormous queue outside the Memorial offices, huge queue. And I started to walk to the front of it, and they said, no, you must go to the back, we are all waiting. And I said, what are you waiting for? They said, to talk to Western researcher about our lives. So I found, thanks to the fact that in 1994, 1995, people were burning to get out of Stalinism, to talk about it. Things were changing so fast. Their lives were becoming pointless. All those years of sacrifice, what was it for? And they wanted to talk about it. And so those were the people I met. Those were the people who haunt me. And I met hundreds and hundreds of them and recorded their stories. So, of course, the 1930s became my decade.
On the subject of PhDs, the meaty hand of the woman working in the Kremlin on her PhD thesis, so you weren't allowed to read it, but did she share anything afterwards, or did she, anything interesting that what you couldn't read?
She wasn't particularly forthcoming. She really wanted me to see how important she was. And she was important, so that was what I saw. Which reminds me of the woman who once invited me to her apartment to talk to me about her war experience and lied to me for an hour and a half while I recorded her. Total, utter lies from beginning to end. There was no cowardice in the Red Army. We were not short of bandages. Nobody was ever killed in horrible ways. It was absolutely victorious from start to finish. And at the end of the interview, I said to her, why did you ask me here? You have just lied to me. I don't usually say that, but I did to her, and I certainly didn't to the lady in the Kremlin. And she said, I know I lied, but I wanted you to see my new parquet floor. So I have a feeling. It was true. The lady in the Kremlin could not let me see her thesis, but she wanted a Westerner in her room to show all that she has done, because actually academics are not respected very much in Russia now. Mostly they're paid really badly. Mostly people are making money doing completely other things. And this woman had worked extremely hard to become very, very specialized in what she did. And here was the only person in the world who wanted to say, I respect what you've done. But she didn't share very much with me.
I think we've got time for another couple of questions.
Thank you. The perception of Russia today is probably as dire as it has been for a very long time. And I confess that having studied Russian literature in the past, I'm very ignorant about current writers and what's going on in literary circles there. But is there, against that backdrop, a sense that there are Russian writers or Western writers who can capture stories from within Russia or about Russia that would appeal to Western audiences and make them feel more positive in a way? I mean, not window dressing, but rather as your books have done, touch on deeper stories. Obviously yours tend to be more decade or two ago, but in terms of the present and maybe the near future.
I think this is a question for my colleague here, but I would suggest you read Sergei Lebedev, whose work is translated into English. It will not give you a positive view of Russia, but it will give you a very positive view of Russian writers now, thinking about what's happening and trying to make sense of it, admittedly, in his case, from emigration in Potsdam. But I think you're the expert.
No, absolutely not. I know nothing about contemporary Russian literature because when I started writing, I stopped reading. I do not read fiction. I haven't read fiction for more than a quarter of a century. I read only nonfiction. Because when you read other people's fiction, it contaminates you, it influences you. It's just, no, I never do that.
You're forgetting the famous words of Tom Lehrer, plagiarize. No one else's work you plagiarize. I understand, because I used to read fiction all the time when I was writing nonfiction. I used to read detective stories all the time when I was writing nonfiction. Now I read nonfiction. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah. But I would suggest you have a look at Sergei Lebedev. There are very few Russian writers whose work will make Russia look good that will not make you throw up. Because if they're trying to make Russia look good, they're writing from inside the Putin bubble, and it isn't very nice to read.
I just wanted to ask, and you started writing fiction. Will you continue writing historical books? I mean, non-fiction, scientific books.
It's difficult to do that from outside the academy, for one thing, and nobody's offering me any grants to do that, though if they would like to. However, the real answer is, I find the kind of history I want to write requires me to be in Russia, in the archives, or in Russia, in people's houses. I cannot do that. I don't want to write, a diplomatic history of Russo-Bulgarian relations, whatever it might be. That's not me. So, given that I am no longer young and Putin is there, I don't see when I'm going to be able to go back. And when maybe I can, then I'll give you another answer. But until then, no.
And it cannot be done at a distance, like with, I don't know, Zoom or whatever, because COVID taught us how to do it.
Can you imagine talking to Russian people about their history on Zoom from this country? What answers I would get? I can. And they wouldn't, they would make very interesting market research, but not very true history, I think. I do have friends who do market research in Russia on Zoom, Russian friends, mostly based in Israel, doing market research in Russia. And the suspicion, the hostility, the way that a curtain is coming down makes it very, very difficult to imagine doing it. So I still would say no. And I need to be there. I think to write about that place as a historian, I need to actually smell it.
I just wanted, Catherine, who was the apparatchik who you wanted to write about when you first went in '93, I think it was? There was a communist official about whom you wanted to write?
Lev Kamenev.
Who?
Kamenev. Lenin's friend Kamenev. I did some of the research even. I mean, if anybody wants it, they're very welcome to it. Why him? Why him? Well, because, first of all, look, I was a PhD student. So the horrible things PhD students say is, well, there's a gap. Well, there was a gap, nobody'd done it. I was quite interested because he'd spent a lot of time in Paris, and I thought maybe I would too. I was also interested because he wasn't the nastiest of the Bolsheviks. He was actually quite intriguing. And then there was the Batman and Robin relationship between him and Zinoviev, which I thought might be very fruitful. But of course I was dreading the end of the story, which is Kamenev being shot. And the whole, 36 actually, and the whole background to those moments at the end of his life during which he had to repudiate everything he'd done, grovel, try and save his wife, all those sorts of things. I thought it was interesting too because his wife was Trotsky's sister. So there was a lot going on with him. But no. I mean, once Russia started getting interesting, sitting in the archives reading Politburo minutes didn't do it.
Thank you. How do you feel your relationship has changed with the reader moving from academic work into fiction? Do you feel more sort of vulnerable or exposed? And how do you navigate that?
Ooh. I feel very vulnerable and very exposed, definitely. The other thing I think is that when you're an academic, your students have to read your books or you'll fail them. So you don't have to try quite so hard because you have a lot of power over your reader as an academic. And as a non-fiction writer, you're telling people facts that they want. So you are giving people something that they have paid up for. Writing fiction, no one has to read it. Nobody is under any obligation to buy your books. And they're not necessarily going to be edified by them or improved or able to pass exams. So you actually have to sympathize with and even love your reader. You actually have to say to your reader, I want you to come with me and I want you to trust me and I'm not going to let you down. And that's very different from what academics do, which is to say, you must come with me because I'm telling you so. It's a very different world and it's actually a much more humane one and I've enjoyed it enormously. But it does make me feel exposed because if you don't like it, I can't say, well, you have to read it. I have to say, oh, I'm sorry about that. But please.
Any final comments?
Well, I wish you a lot of joy with this new profession. This is really wonderful. This is a new life, and it's a great life. Much, much better than being an academic. Thank Putin for that. At least the man has done something good in his life. And good sales to your book.
And I want to say thank you to all of you, because you are the readers that I want to charm, beguile, and bring along with me. And I'm really glad you all came this evening, but I'm most glad of all that Boris Akunin was able to talk about it. Such an honor. And also thank you to Rachel for organizing it.
I would also like to thank Catherine and Grigory for joining us tonight for that wonderful discussion. We've got plenty of their books for sale downstairs, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign some copies for you. And our bar is going to be open next door if you'd like to stay with us for a drink. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.